Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining today's NCPERS semi-annual state and federal legislation webcast. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director of NCPERS. Today's program is part of our expanded Center for Online Learning. Joining me today are our regular contributors, Bridget Early, formerly the Executive Director of the National Public Pension Coalition, and Tony Roda, principal at the law and lobbying firm of Williams and Jensen. For those of us who've been joining us regularly, you know what the format is, but to reiterate, this will be a moderated conversation with our two panelists. To help audience participation and facilitate interaction with our audience, we will be posting a few audience polls during this session. Also, we do encourage your questions and comments, so please submit them through this platform, either in the Q&A function or in the chat function. In order to cover all the topics that we have today, those may be held till the end of the session. So overall, we're going to be doing four broad areas. We're going to review what happened in 2022. Then we're going to talk about the midterms, both at the federal and at the state level. Then we're going to start looking forward to 2023. And then lastly, we'll take the last quarter of this presentation to go over your questions and comments. So with that, let's start and talk about reviewing 2022. And Bridget, let me start with you. Tell us in sort of broad overstrokes how you would characterize activities at the state level in 2022. Was it generally very active? And if they were active, what were the ultimate results? And from a macro sense, and then we can get into individual states in a moment.
Great. Yeah. So I would say in the experience that states had that work with NPPC, each state was uniquely different in the sense of what topics ended up coming to light. You have, for many states who operate on a 2-year legislative calendar, folks getting ready for re-election, maybe they're wrapping up budgets, et cetera. So I think a lot of areas in which people played it safe, that's what they tried to do in order to make the case going into the legislative sessions into the elections, that they could best represent their constituency. Obviously, the other big piece that was a big focus of the 2022 year and also part of 2021 was a lot of redistricting. So new maps being set across the board that impacted not just the decision making, but also then who still would be employed effectively come 2023. And so those being the broader issues, we still saw different pension-specific, retirement-specific issues popped up. Obviously, always the case of folks wanting to talk about plan design. And then bits and pieces around funding and making sure funding made it to systems. And then I think a little bit that I'll go into is the push and pull between legislative involvement in the administrative side, specifically the investment side of pension systems. So those are the big themes.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. Tony, welcome. Likewise, from your perspective, again, in broad strokes, 2022, what did you see in Congress and from the administration?
Well, thank you, Hank, and thanks for the introduction. And it's always great to be here with Bridget and you. From a macro sense, I think what we're seeing in Congress is retirement issues are consistently bipartisan, especially with regard to access, affordability, these kinds of high-level retirement security issues are really very bipartisan. And Congress has a focus in this area that is demonstrated by, I think, this fact. So in 2006, the Pension Protection Act was enacted. That was a major piece of retirement legislation. But it took 13 years to 2019 for the Secure Act to be enacted. So that was a long gap. Right now, Congress is working and is poised, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a few minutes, but is poised to potentially enact the Secure Act 2.0, just 3 years after the Secure Act. So I think that demonstrates, with the aging of the population, retirement security being very much on the minds of members of Congress from both parties. And I think that's a very important fact going forward for all the advocacy work that we do. And we can go to members of both political parties on these issues often and as necessary, stitch together a bipartisan grouping of champions on a particular proposal and look for that opportunity to move that idea through Congress. So I look at what I've seen in 2022 as very positive on the retirement front.
Great, thank you, Tony. All right, so Bridget, let me turn it back to you. Give us some more details and a flavor of individual states that you were referencing in your opening remarks.
Absolutely. So for the states in which conversations around plan design / plan participation varied, so on the defensive side, one in Kansas specifically, we learned of a bill that was moved that they attempted to move really swiftly. A senator from the state, Senator Tyson, had introduced a bill in hopes of converting the NCPERS plan to a thrift savings plan. Not something that we had heard specifically would be happening, but always knowing that the legislature there is comprised of has more of a conservative base, a state we've always kept an eye on. So fortunately, the state coalition and NPPC was able to act swiftly to stop that bill from progressing forward.
And Bridget, just to clarify, when you say the alternative or the legislation would convert NCPERS to a thrift savings, you're talking about the defined contribution portion of the federal retirement system, right? Like essentially the 401k for federal employees.
Using the federal system, the federal blueprint, and applying it to a new tier of NCPERS. Right now, they do have a cash balance, which does offer, I guess, a bit more of a guarantee than tier 1 and tier 2. But this would further erode security for NCPERS participants. Got it.
So they were saying so to mirror like what the federal employees currently have, which is it's the FERS, Federal Employee Retirement System, which has a very small, or they have a DB component, which has a very small multiplier, and then on top of that, like a defined contribution savings.
Yep.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. So that was on the defensive side. On the proactive side, one of the big states that has been the focus of plan design changes has been Alaska. A lot of information continues to come out about the adverse effects closing the system has had on the state. And not just the cost of trying to make up the contributions to keep the state's system's funding levels in an attempt to keep them at a more healthy level in order to make sure that they can pay out the benefits already promised. But I think secondary unintended consequence that happened is the turnover, the significant turnover Alaska has experienced in its workforce. One local leader described it as teacher tourism. There's nothing really keeping teachers and public employees in Alaska because there's nothing to build towards when it comes to a defined benefit plan. And so people will go up to Alaska, work for a little bit and then be able to take that experience and go get a more secure position in the lower 48. And so that, in addition to, obviously trying to recruit people with an incentive program, numbers show that it probably is costing the state around $20 million additionally a year in the recruitment and retention issue, on top of the loss of the secure revenue that was going in with the previous plan design. So the bill was able to move forward in the House last year. And then I think where the state continues to be hopeful for both on the public safety and the public employee side, the two systems will be able to hopefully make more movement going into this next legislative session. The other state, I think, a lot of the things that I think I'll reference a lot is obviously there's staff shortages. How can public employee or public employers recruit and retain quality public employees? And so in Kentucky, there was a bill to have hazardous duty or positions that would likely be classified as hazardous duty in public safety be able to come back into the Kentucky system in order to have a defined benefit plan, especially since, one example that's used often is that with the border of Indiana, a lot of times public safety employees are able to just cross the border and secure a job that does have a defined benefit. So that was the plan design piece.
Great. All right. Well, hold off on the other stuff. Let me turn over to Tony. Tony, let's dig a little bit into the details of 2022.
Absolutely. So I mentioned the Secure Act 2.0, which is the major piece of retirement legislation that's poised again for action, final action in these last few weeks of the 117th Congress. And there are provisions in the bill. Some have called it a grab bag of provisions. They're all very important, probably over 60 to 70 in play right now. A couple of general topics, then I'll get into some that are very specific to public safety, one in particular. But right now, the legislation would increase the age trigger for required minimum distributions for both DB and DC plans from age 72, which was just changed to 72 in the Secure Act in 2019, to age 75. There's been a very vocal and active lobby on that issue. People are saying that they don't need to take these required minimum distributions and they're living longer. So why do I have to start so early? So Congress is definitely heard that and is definitely pushing that date out. And I think if there is legislation that will be moved to 75. Also further recognition of the need to make retirement contributions to these account-based plans as you get closer to retirement age. So what's known as the catch-up contribution for those age 50 or over would be increased to $10,000 per year from the 2022 level of $6,500. It would not be for everyone age 50 and over. It would be, there are two different approaches, but it's going to hit in the 60s. So it's either 60 to 63, 62 to 64. Each chamber has a different take on it, but that's what they're looking at. And then on the public safety specific front, Hank and I have spent a considerable time spoken with the councils of all the major pension committees on this topic, and that's the HELPS issue, the Healthcare Enhancement for Local Public Safety Act that was enacted back in that 2006 bill. And just a refresher, it is in its entirety, Section 402L of the tax code. And what it does is it provides an exclusion for retired first responders from part of their distribution from a retirement plan if the funds are used for a health care or long-term care premium payment. The catch is, or the condition is, that the retirement system has to make the payment to the provider of the health care or long-term care insurance. And there are three buckets of public pension plans out there. One is fine with that. It's probably the case that there are smaller plans with very few providers to pay. So it is not administratively difficult to do that. Then there are plans that are implementing HELPS, but are not happy about the way it is because they have to make these payments to multiple providers with premiums changing for tens and thousands of retirees. It's a very complicated situation that they are in. But they're doing it, but they're not happy and they're asking for relief. And then there are those plans that are not implementing it at all because of the administrative burden. And this is, it's a real loss for the first responders in those jurisdictions because they're not eligible for the tax exclusion at all that Congress intended back in 2006. So the provision in Secure 2.0 would make this direct payment optional. So if you're in the first category and you're doing it and everybody's happy, you can keep doing it. But if this is too much of an administrative burden and are not implementing it or are implementing it under great duress, you would have the option to just simply make the distribution payment to the retiree and have him or her pay their own premium. So I think this is a really well thought out solution. We've had some tremendous bipartisan, going back to my earlier theme, support on this. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio has been the lead from day one, but Senator Grassley of Iowa, Senator Thune of South Dakota have been extremely helpful as well on the Republican side. So very pleased with where that is. It's in the Senate bill. We are hopeful that a final product, House Senate compromise, will include that provision. We continue our advocacy efforts on that. And I'll stop there because I think Bridget wanted to talk about a few more things. And then I had one more topic to raise.
Perfect. All right, Bridget. So in terms of state level, wrapping up 2022, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say the two other things. So the two other things that had come up that I think will continue to carry over involve Colorado and Arizona. In Colorado, something I think we've tried to highlight and make sure lawmakers across the country understand that they can't legislate future dollars. There's nothing binding about legislation that promises future dollars from a budget. It's binding when it's an employer contribution, and when it's an employee contribution as part of their employment, they will give a certain percentage towards their retirement. But when laws are passed that also say, in the case of Colorado, that you will pay X amount over the course of several years, lawmakers are not bound by that. And so because of that, in Colorado, the work of the coalition there was able to ensure that the payment that was skipped in 2020, right when the pandemic hit, was recouped by the system. And they also were able to receive an additional $155 million to provide an early prepayment for the 2023 direct payment. So in total, it came to $380 million with the 225 annual state payment that had been pledged with the compromise bill back in 2018. And so, I know the people in Colorado that continue to do this work will continue to monitor it, but I think in any state in which this is an idea that may get floated as a potential solution towards how do we address or stabilize funding, is really important to remember that everyone can come together and say, great, this is great. And the state can always walk away from it in the next budgetary year. And so folks have to be vigilant to pay attention to those pledges being made. On the flip side, I think, and something that when we talk a bit about what we're going to see in 2023 is the increased participation by lawmakers in trying to legislate how investments are made. And oftentimes from a ideological standpoint. Case in point, in Arizona, this bill was sponsored by a long-term lawmaker. So he's somebody who had a bit more political capital to spend to, ask legislative leadership to have this bill moved, that would have demanded every investment Arizona made, so the state treasurer and the pension systems, divest from any business that profited or supported other organizations that supported any support of reproductive health or sex education. And so one example that I would use is that Merck, the large pharmaceutical company that's a Forbes 500 company, is a corporate sponsor of Planned Parenthood. And so instead of looking at what this, pharmaceutical company's potential revenue earnings were, they would be pulled from the list of potential investments that Arizona could invest in. And that's not being a sound fiduciary. And so we're going to see that also more come up, because this is an issue that ALEC and Reason have also started to poke around in when it comes to how things should be invested. That will certainly bleed into 2023 and future issues and future legislatures.
Well, thank you, Bridget, for that summary. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we look towards 2023. Tony, wrapping up 2022 for you in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to talk about two things fairly quickly. The windfall elimination provision, the Social Security offset that hits public sector workers so hard if they are in the crosshairs of that penalty, and they've earned both a FICA employment-based Social Security benefit and a pension from state or local work that was not covered by FICA. There's been a lot of activity on it. There's been a lot of attempts made on rectifying WEP over the years. Earlier this year, there was a threshold crossed on the House bill that would repeal both WEP and the government pension offset, which is oftentimes called a sister penalty to WEP. It deals with survivor benefits. But what had happened was procedurally, the major repeal bill crossed the 218 co-sponsor level. That's a simple majority in the House. And that made it eligible for a consensus calendar procedure that would have brought it to the floor in an expedited way, bypassing the committees. However, with all of these special expedited procedures, Congress has given themselves an ability to get out from under it. And the Ways and Means Committee was able to get out from under this and simply report the bill without comment. So, or without taking a position on it, essentially. So that forestalled the vote on the House floor on full repeal. However, ongoing discussions are being had between Ways and Means Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Kevin Brady, who is retiring, on trying to find this WEP-only solution. It would not cover GPO at this point. That would be a proportional formula that would provide some type of hold harmless benefit, some type of monthly rebate to those already being hit by WEP. But they're not there yet. And there have been emails exchanged this week with key staff, and that work continues. And I don't want to be overly optimistic about it because it's been so many years in the offing. But I just wanted people to know that that effort continues. And then the last.
I'm sorry, Tony, to interrupt, but I don't know if you see it, but we did have poll question with the audience about whether WEP is an important issue for them and whether GPO, and 87% of respondents said WEP is important issue, and 80% of audience members said government pension offset is an important issue.
Thank you, Hank. That's important to know, and it does not surprise me. It has been a burr in the saddle for years, but thank you for that input, everyone out there. The other issue I'd mention, and Bridget's comments kind of get us there, which is the environmental social governance investing issue, which is one of the hottest issues in the investment world today. And I just wanted to flag, and we can talk about it later, because I think it's going to play out a little more in the next Congress. But the Biden administration, just before Thanksgiving, did finalize its rule on ESG investing. In my view, they took a step back from the proposed rule, which many thought was a de facto mandate to scrutinize every single investment under the ESG lens. I didn't read it that way. I thought it was still discretionary, but enough concerns were raised, I think, that the Biden administration took those into account and did, again, my reading, soften the final language in the final rule and put it much more in the context of a risk and return analysis, which hopefully will make people more comfortable. It will not placate everyone who's a critic of this type of approach to investing or these factors being used. But I just wanted to flag that. And we'll talk about that more in our next round, looking at.
Yeah, 2023. Yep, great. Thank you, Tony. All right, so let's shift gears and talk a little bit about what happened in the midterms. And we have a poll question about the midterms as well. So as the audience is answering this question, Tony, let me start with you again. And from a federal perspective, give us the lay of the land for the next Congress, the 118th Congress.
Well, the big takeaway from this election was that the Democrats really defied odds and recent history in holding the Senate. I saw a statistic last night. It was on one of the news programs where this is the first time in 88 years where the party of the president in the first term, midterm, held every single seat in the Senate.
Yeah,
they had. In fact, picked up one in Pennsylvania. So it was really a remarkable election from that historical perspective. You hearken back to the Obama first term, midterm, which were over a 60-seat loss by the Democrats, and President Trump's first only midterm, where the Republican Party, lost 40 seats. So those were House seats lost. And right now we have a new House majority coming in with a very low single-digit majority. So let me stay with the Senate for just a second. Why does it matter that the Senate is now 51-49 as opposed to 50-50? Well, there are a number of things. One is that you really control the committees. Committees under the current Congress are split, whatever number it is, it's 10-10, 14-14. Those committees don't have full control. They have the ability to bring up legislation, but they don't really report legislation in the formal kind of sense that we've seen with a majority-run Senate. They also don't have full subpoena power. Another factor is Senator Manchin has been the kingmaker and the policymaker really in the Senate, and by virtue of that in the Congress. 51 means that they can lose a senator. The current situation where the vice president must break all ties is no longer the case. So it's definitely a different situation for Majority Leader Schumer and for the Democratic Party. And it also sets them up a little better for the 2024 cycle, although there are going to be real challenges in 2024 with the states that are in play and the potential, again, for a Republican switch in the Senate. But running up against that, Democratic president, Democratic Senate is the House. And whether it's a one-seat majority, it's a majority. And so if Kevin McCarthy is elected Speaker on January 3rd, and there are a lot of questions surrounding that, and everyone just says at this point he doesn't have the votes yet, but it's not January 3rd, so he doesn't need to have the votes today. I'm sure he'd love to have the votes today. But whoever is Speaker on the Republican side is going to be able to set the agenda for the House and pass whatever pieces of legislation they want, even knowing that the Senate would not consider them. They'll be in a position to stop what they view as more extreme, Biden administration initiatives, or simply stop everything, except for the very narrow set of bills that are needed to keep the government funded. So I think what we're going to see is a lot of oversight. I think oversight's good. I think when you're sending out hundreds of billions of dollars, you need to know that it got to the right people. You need to know that the tax benefits that you've enacted are going to the right people. I think oversight is healthy in a democracy. It can be politicized, but I think it is a healthy mechanism. I also think that we're going to see from the House a lot of messaging legislation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that. But again, bills that they know they can pass, but the Senate will not pass. And they're potentially setting up these issues for the presidential cycle in 2024. So I'm just looking at my notes here. I think that really is the crux of it. I think a very, very interesting election. I do think what Senator McConnell said early on, that candidate quality matters. And I think we saw that play out even this week in Georgia. So I think both parties will learn from that.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Bridget, going back to the state level, what were the elections that were interesting to you, and how do you view the results of the midterm as we look towards 2023?
Yeah, so similar to Tony, I think a lot of it was a really big surprise on election day to come out, on election night, to come out and see how things ended up shaking out. So again, in the same statistic of how the party in power and presidential power shakes up the legislative branch, also trickles down into typically into trends that are experienced at the state level. Really, if you were a gubernatorial incumbent, you were in good shape. There was only one incumbent in Nevada that lost, and I only hesitate because I know I'm going to screw up saying the state name. I think I got it right, but sometimes my Midwestern comes out. That was the only the only incumbent gubernatorial control that flipped. We actually saw Democrats gain control of 4 legislatures, take back several chambers. So they went from having 37 legislative chambers to 41, with 58, the other 58 chambers being controlled by Republicans. And that total doesn't include the chambers in Nebraska, because technically they're a nonpartisan legislature, but the they're also most likely controlled. It's mostly controlled by Republicans in Nebraska. That being said, we also though saw between redistricting and I think just legislative retirement, a higher rate of turnover amongst those seats. So even though maybe seats held the party vote or helped maybe switch some of the party control, there's still going to be plenty of fresh faces coming into these legislative chambers soon. I'm sure orientations, bill filing has all begun to gear up in some of these states for 2023. We also knew going into, there was an analysis done prior to the election that 32 of the top legislative leadership positions across the country we're gonna include new leaders. So not only are we going to see new lawmakers, but we're also going to see new legislative leaders who are going to determine committee assignments, caucus priorities, those pieces that are going to be important to focus on, because not only are they carrying the will of the people that elected them to their seat, but now they're also the leaders of their party in these chambers that will have priorities set for them in that way as well.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Bridget and Tony. So let's start looking into our crystal ball and talk about what we might anticipate for 2023. Tony, let me start with you. And before we get into 2023, let me ask your sort of prognostication about what might happen in the lame duck session of Congress.
An excellent question. And the pendulum swings every day on what can be accomplished and what cannot be accomplished. And again, we're talking about sites from today to January 3rd. Will they go that far? I think they probably go right up until Christmas, and that's where they pull the plug. But lame duck Congresses have returned the week between Christmas and New Year's. So no one really can tell, first off, when the lame duck session is finally run its course until we see it. Legislation like the Secure Act 2.0, which is very important to us, is not going to go separately through the chambers. It's going to have to go onto a larger piece of legislation. And the one that is being targeted, and not targeted just by retirement advocates such as ourselves, but targeted by everybody who wants anything done, is the omnibus appropriations bill. So we're running on a continuing resolution, which is, all that means is it's a short-term funding bill. It has an expiration date in, I think it's December 16th. But the fiscal year runs until September 30th. So negotiators are working on this omnibus appropriations bill. That'll be for the duration of the fiscal year. And on that bill, items like the Secure Act 2.0 could ride. The windfall elimination provision, the WEP only solution, is also, I think, in play is too strong. But if the negotiations between Brady and Neal can yield something, then it becomes in play. And it just needs to be in play before the final decisions are made. So Hank, for purposes of the lame duck, those are the items that are really being looked at very closely by our community at this point.
Right. All right. Well, Bridget, let me turn it over to you and ask you to look in your crystal ball. What do you foresee for 2023 in terms of sort of broad swath of legislation and action at the state level?
Yeah, so I think the three things that I would monitor would be, what does the revenue forecast look like for my state, especially in light of federal dollars not coming in? and in some cases where there were states that actually implemented income tax cuts, whether a one-time or a permanent tax cut, to see, what are the conversations around not as a less robust revenue stream for the state. What are the solutions being proposed to address the wide sweeping staffing shortages that still exist, especially among the public workforce? And then finally, what I had mentioned earlier around what some opponents are trying to push around anti-ESG measures that will, attempt to have lawmakers tell the investment professionals how best to look and manage the fund. Those are the big things that I think are coming up, that are also, and then of course, the regular, with a whole batch of new lawmakers, someone's going to come into a state and say, it's a great idea. Let's make a plan design change. And if you have high turnover, there's not a lot of people around to say, well, actually, we already tried that and it didn't work. So that also being another key thing to monitor for.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bridget. And before I turn it over to Bridget, I did mention at the beginning when I introduced Bridget that she was formerly the Executive Director of NPPC. Bridget resigned her position as Executive Director. It was in August, right, of this year, to focus on her graduate work in social work. And now that she's almost a few days away from completing, I'd like to informally announce that Bridget will be joining NCPERS as our Director of Membership and Strategic Alliances. We'll make a formal announcement with the press release in January, but since Bridget's joined us on this webcast, and this is apropos, I just wanted to welcome you, Bridget, to the NCPERS staff.
Thank you. I'm very excited to continue this work and join Hank and Tony and the team, focusing on this really amazing issue around protecting retirement. So thank you.
Great. Tony, all right. So what else do you see going on in 2023? So with the reorganization of the House, more of a margin in the Senate, how do you see that laying out relative to the issues that we're concerned about?
Sure, Hank, but let me first congratulate Bridget. It's wonderful news, and look forward to working with you on these many issues. So you're joining a great organization.
Thank you.
Let's hope we can do Secure Act 2.0 and WEP in this year, in this Congress. That's a hope. So if one or both are not completed, then we have to renew efforts on them. For Secure 2.0, it makes me less nervous, just because so much work has been done on it, and in a very bipartisan way. A new Congress is likely to pick up where they left off. There may be some new issues introduced. It may take a while, but I do feel that tremendous foundation has been laid on Secure 2.0. But again, fingers crossed that it can be done in the 117th. And then for WEP, again, if we have to start anew on WEP, that's been the saga of WEP and GPO, unfortunately. So let's hope again that the 117th Congress can make some strides on WEP. And if it is a WEP only bill, it may not be the end of the effort on WEP. It's probably not the be all end all. And then of course, GPO is likely to not be touched at all by this Congress. So if we're successful there, I think we're going to look at some additions to the HELPS legislation. So as I outlined HELPS earlier, I didn't mention that there's a $3,000 annual cap on what can be excluded by a retired first responder for payments for healthcare and long-term care premiums. That $3,000 has not changed since 2006, 15 years of the same number. Normally, this would be something that would be indexed for inflation. At the very least, I think 3,000 should be indexed. There was legislation, however, in the House, HR 7203 by Abigail Spanberger, Democratic Congresswoman from Virginia, bipartisan legislation. She was actually the lead Democratic sponsor, and Steve Chabot of Ohio, Republican, was the author of the bill. That would have raised it to 6,000. So it would have doubled the 3,000 to 6. I think that there's going to be a real evaluation and effort to look at that $3,000 cap. In the same vein is a bill introduced in May by the senator from Colorado, Bennett, who serves on the Finance Committee, which is the tax writing committee. That legislation, S4267, would create a new credit, a new tax credit, which is different than a tax exclusion. A credit is, depending on your tax situation, a more powerful tool. And that credit would be for retired first responders for the same purpose, paying their health care and long-term care premiums. And the credit would be up to $4,800 a year. The legislation would also index the $3,000 cap under HELPS. And the Bennett bill would say you can't use both. So you look at your tax situation at the end of the year, if this were enacted, and decide which is of more benefit to you. I know that groups are getting ready to really make a push on Senator Bennett's bill for the next Congress. I know NCPERS will be strongly supportive. Last I looked, it did not have a Republican co-sponsor, and it does not have a House companion bill. So, as I said earlier, you want to set this up, set the stage so that you have strong Republican and Democratic support in each chamber from the committees of jurisdiction. And then I will say, on the defensive side, we've seen some legislative proposals, tax legislative proposals in the past, the unrelated business income tax, which would have been specifically applied to state and local governmental plans by a provision passed in the House in 2017, would have affected many private equity investments and hedge fund investments. It was unclear at the time, just what the reach of it would have been. But that was something we were able successfully to turn back in 2017. The Senate did not have the same provision, and we were able to ensure that that did not make it into a conference report on the 2017 tax bill. We could also see the return of PEPTA, the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, which was introduced for decades by a longtime Ways and Means member, Republican Devin Nunes, who has since resigned from Congress. But PEPTA's drafted, it's on the shelf, it could easily be taken by another member of the committee. PEPTA would require all state and local governmental plans to report their funded status based on their first their assumed rate of return, but second, on a federal bond rate, which is going to show a much lower, of course, funded ratio. We've been able to turn PEPTA back, Congress after Congress, but that's something, again, that I could see returning. House Republicans in the past have been behind both of those issues. And, we could well see a return of it. Also, ESG, we've talked about the issue a good bit. I really expect there to be legislation in the House on ESG and an attempt to turn back the Biden final rule, or more dramatically and more significantly place restrictions in the way Bridget was talking about on what investments could be made by federally tax qualified plans. I don't know if there's an appetite to go that far in the House, but I do think that the House Republicans see ESG as great political fodder. And I think they're going to use the issue throughout the Congress. There'll be hearings, and I expect legislation on it. This is one of those areas. This is a messaging area, however. In some states, this is a real threat. In Congress, given the division in the next Congress between the House Republicans and Senate Democrats, it's not anything that could become law. But it could certainly be used as a messaging piece throughout the Congress. And Hank, those are really the areas that I'd be focused on. Social Security, I'll just mention comprehensive reform of Social Security. I don't see that, in the years leading up to a major Social Security bill. There's always been a lot of bipartisan efforts on it, and we just haven't seen that. And Social Security being such an enormous program, you're really going to have buy-in on Social Security to move anything. And in that context, why am I talking about it? It's really because of the threat of mandatory Social Security for new hires in the public workforce who are not currently covered by Social Security. So mandatory Social Security is the buzz term. And we could well see, in the context of a larger Social Security bill, an effort to do that. But again, I don't see the political ingredients in place for a serious effort on Social Security.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And before we turn it over to Q&A, which we have a number of, and I'll pause here for a second and also just encourage folks who are still with us to, if you have any questions or comments, please submit them through the Q&A function, and we'll definitely get to that. But before we do, a couple of quick things. First is, I think some of the uncertainty that both Bridget and Tony spoke about, we will have a little bit more clarity later on next month when we host our legislative conference and public pension comms summit, which will be held January 22nd through the 24th. So encourage folks, if you're interested in legislation at the federal, state level, to join us in Washington, D.C. and learn a little bit more about what the new Congress and new structure may bring, as well as what's going to happen at the state level. And then in terms of just going back to Bridget and her position, I just wanted to expand on that and talk about what we meant by strategic alliances, because Bridget's going to be in charge of membership and strategic alliances. So, what we envision is Bridget continuing the work that she has, largely mirroring the work that she's done at NPPC, but doing it for NCPERS. So being focused on issues and legislation at the state and local level. And we have a poll coming up right now talking about one of the aspects we've been toying with relative to what Bridget's role may be, which is just like we host the federal legislative conference on the annual basis, what the value might be for NCPERS hosting legislative conferences in individual state capitals where there seems to be activity. So we'd love to get your opinion on that. And with that, if there are no other comments from Bridget or Tony, I'll turn it over to the questions. So a number of these questions, I think they were already answered, but let me go to one that I think would be interesting. So Tony, what regulation or legislation do you see in the horizon for defined contribution innovation, like PEP plans in the private market?
I think there is a provision in the Secure Act 2.0 that would allow 403B plans into collective investment trusts. And that provision has not been completely worked out. There is a federal tax code piece to it, but there's also a federal securities law piece to it. And the federal securities law piece, in Congress, you have two different sets of committees right now. Now you've got the tax committee, you've got the banking committee. So it's become complicated on that end. The securities piece is still being negotiated and worked on. But that's one area, Hank, that I see in the way of allowing 403Bs into collective investment trusts. I was talking to someone about the general topic 2 days ago, and it's clear that public sector plans are in a different world than private sector plans, in as much as there is universal access for public sector workers to retirement plans. They may differ and do differ, in various jurisdictions, of course. But so the access piece has been much more aimed at the private sector, and NCPERS' longstanding efforts on the secure choice plan and state-run plans that are for private sector workers. I think that's where the real movement is going to be with regard to bringing more people into a DC plan. I know those are mostly IRAs, but it is in essence a DC plan. So Hank, those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, great. Bridget, to you, in terms of what you've noticed relative to plan design legislation, when you first came to NPPC, I think a lot of the legislation that were introduced was effectively shutting down the defined benefit plan, right, and converting it to a defined contribution. Have you seen a shifting of that sort of approach where it's a little bit more nuanced, like in Kansas, or are there still legislation that's hardcore and saying we're going to shut down public plans?
So I think that is a conversation happening right now in North Dakota. Through their interim session this year, the charge of the interim committee was tell us how to shut down the plan. But then again, on the flip side, there are additional conversations happening. I failed to mention in Oklahoma of, I think, people seeing that the switch to a DC isn't working. And so do we reopen and expand access again? So yes, I think that there's sort of both things happening. As far as more nuanced or other ways to get around the benefit, I don't think anyone yet has been able to craft or articulate something that can get past also some of the constitutional measures that are holding up a bulk of plan participants from being switched, right? They've got constitutional or legal protections in place, and not being able to take a big bite out of that apple has not, I think, generated as much interest in trying to move more people than just new employees at this point.
Okay, great. There is a question about, are there any proposals to address the impact of the new actuarial valuation standards being implemented nationally? So I believe this is in reference to ASOP 4, which will come into effect for the actuarial community in mid-February. So the short answer is there is no federal or state legislation or regulation to address it, but there is a coalition that includes names that you'll recognize, including us, NASRA, NCTR, and NCPERS, who are working on talking points and fact sheets relative to ASOP 4. Our target in terms of this disseminating this talking points and fact sheet is early 2023. So stand by on that. Tony, there is a question about any hope of increasing the pre-tax amount in HELPS. I think you talked about it, but if you want to quickly address it.
Absolutely. Not in this Congress, but I think the seeds have been planted for a real hard look at it. So hopefully we deal with the direct payment requirement in this Congress. And then we start to look at that $3,000 cap, because there's been legislation on it, and I know there's interest in doing it. It may just become a cost issue as to how quickly and how high it can be raised, but it's for a future tax bill.
Yeah. More of a comment than a question, saying that it says FRS, but I believe it was Florida. The governor and the legislature did a similar anti-woke investing, all but banning ESG and diversity from being part of any investment conversation. Yeah, any comments or thoughts about that?
And ALEC has a model bill. So if you're looking for the language that might be used, ALEC has a model bill out there. I know it was already filed in Michigan around this. So it's anticipated to continue to crop up.
And as I mentioned earlier, at the federal level in Congress as well, or at least in the House Republican-controlled chamber next year.
Okay. Well, we are at the top of the hour. There are one or two other questions still in the queue, but we apologize for not getting to them. But we do encourage you to come and join us in January at the legislative conference, and feel free to raise your questions again. Bridget, Tony, thank you again for your insightful thoughts and commentary. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. Happy holidays and Happy New Year. And we will see you in 2023. Take care, everybody.
Happy holidays.